Through the November fog, Duke Lucien Thauvin collapsed at his daughter's marble tomb, shattering the cemetery's silence with anguished sobs. Hidden behind ancient oak, 12-year-old Nancy watched her father's torment. Alive, escaped, and carrying a secret that would expose the murderers he called family.
Hello. If you believe every underdog deserves to be seen and lifted up, your support means more than you know. Hitting 1,000 subscribers isn't just a number for us, it's what allows these real, hopeful stories to reach people who might desperately need them to stay motivated. Your one click could be the reason someone keeps going. Please help us reach more hearts by subscribing now.
The cemetery at Ravencrest Manor lay shrouded in November fog, each ancient gravestone rising like a ghostly sentinel through the mist. The air carried that particular chill that seems to seep into the bones, the kind that makes even the living feel half dead. Duke Lucien Thauvin walked alone among his ancestors, his footsteps heavy on the frost-covered path, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. 6 months had passed since he buried his only child, and yet the wound felt as fresh as the day they lowered her coffin into the earth. The distinguished peer of the realm, master of 10,000 acres spanning Yorkshire's finest lands and a fortune built on American railroads, looked nothing like the powerful man society knew. His shoulders sagged beneath his greatcoat. His face, once commanding and sharp, had become gaunt, hollowed by grief that no amount of wealth could ease. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, speaking of countless sleepless nights. He walked as one already half in the grave himself. Before him stood the white marble tomb, elaborate and expensive, carved with angels and inscribed with words that tore at his heart every time he read them. Nancy Elizabeth Thauvin, beloved daughter taken by fever, may she rest in God's grace. 12 years old, just 12 years old when scarlet fever claimed her at his wife's London townhouse. The guilt hadn't left him for a single moment. He should have been there, should have protected her, should have done something, anything, to prevent the fever from taking his precious girl. Lucien knelt before the cold marble, his knees pressing into the damp earth, and the dam broke. Sobs racked his body, deep and anguished, echoing through the silent cemetery. His hands pressed against the stone as if he could somehow reach through to touch her one more time. "Forgive me, Nancy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Forgive me for failing you. You were everything, my darling girl. Everything I lived for, everything I worked for, and I couldn't save you." He pulled the silver locket from his pocket, the one he'd given her on her last birthday, the one they'd buried with her. Or so he thought. He'd had another made, identical, and he clutched it now like a lifeline to a world that no longer existed. "You promised you'd always be my little girl," he continued, tears streaming unchecked down his face. "You promised we'd ride together through the estate every morning. You promised to help me manage the American properties when you were older. How am I supposed to go on without you?" What Duke Lucien Thauvin didn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, was that his daughter stood mere yards away, very much alive. Behind the ancient oak tree, its thick trunk providing cover, 12-year-old Nancy Thauvin watched her father's complete breakdown with tears streaming down her own pale, thin face. Her small hands gripped the rough bark until her knuckles turned white. Her heart hammered so violently in her chest she feared it might burst. Every fiber of her being screamed to run to him, to throw herself into his arms, to tell him she was alive, she was here, she'd never stopped loving him. But she couldn't move, she couldn't speak, because revealing herself now might cost them both their lives. Nancy's throat constricted as she fought to contain a sob. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, using the pain to keep herself silent. She watched her father press his forehead against the cold marble of her false grave, watched his shoulders shake with the force of his grief, and it was torture beyond anything a child should endure. "I promise you, my darling," Lucien's voice carried through the fog, "I'll find a way to go on. Even though I feel I died the day you did. Even though every breath without you is agony. I'll try, Nancy. For you, I'll try." Nancy waited until her father's footsteps faded into the distance, until the cemetery gate creaked shut, until she was certain he was gone. Only then did she allow herself to collapse against the oak tree, sliding down its trunk as silent sobs racked her thin frame. She pressed her hands over her mouth, muffling the sounds of her anguish. How long she stayed there, she couldn't say. Minutes, hours? Time had lost all meaning in the 6 months since her world had been torn apart. But she couldn't stay. The sun was sinking lower, and with the approaching darkness came a terror that froze her blood. She had to get back before they discovered her absence, before they realized she'd escaped, even for these few precious hours. Nancy rose on unsteady legs and began the treacherous journey back to her prison. Thornbury Mill sat 3 miles across the Yorkshire countryside, an abandoned relic from a forgotten era. The old water wheel still turned slowly in the current, creaking and groaning like the bones of something long dead. It was the perfect place to hide someone the world believed was buried 6 feet under. The journey was brutal. Nancy's shoes, worn thin from months of pacing her locked room, offered little protection from the rocky terrain. Her dress, once fine silk befitting a duke's daughter, now hung in tatters. She'd grown so thin that the fabric seemed to swallow her small frame. Hunger gnawed at her constantly. They fed her, but barely enough to survive, just enough to keep her alive for whatever purpose they had in mind. As she crossed the moors, memories assaulted her. 6 months ago, she'd been at the London townhouse on Grosvenor Square with her stepmother, Duchess Paulina. Her father had business in Yorkshire and would join them later. Nancy remembered feeling unwell one evening. Paulina had given her tea, sweet and warm, and told her to rest. But the sleep that came wasn't natural. When Nancy woke, everything had changed. She was no longer in the elegant townhouse. She was in a dark, cold room that smelled of mildew and decay. Her screams brought no one. Her tears changed nothing. Days passed before she understood that no rescue was coming, that somehow, impossibly, the world believed she was dead, that her father had buried an empty coffin while she rotted in this forgotten mill. She still didn't know why. Who would fake the death of a duke's daughter? Who would go to such elaborate lengths, bribing physicians, forging death certificates, staging an entire funeral? The questions haunted her through endless days and sleepless nights. But she knew one thing with certainty. Her captors were careless. They believed her broken, defeated, too weak to attempt escape. They'd grown complacent. 2 weeks ago, Nancy had discovered that the window bars in her room were loose, corroded by years of Yorkshire rain and neglect. She'd worked them slowly, carefully, night after night, until finally she could squeeze through. Today had been her first escape, her only goal, to see her father one last time, to know he was real, that the world beyond her prison still existed. She hadn't planned beyond that. But now, having witnessed his suffering, having seen what her supposed death had done to him, something hardened inside her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about truth, about justice, about finding her way back to him, no matter the cost. The mill loomed ahead in the gathering dusk, its silhouette dark against the dimming sky. Nancy's heart raced as she approached the back wall where her window waited. She glanced around, saw no one, and began to climb. The loose stones provided footholds she'd memorized. She squeezed through the bars, dropping silently into her room. The door was still closed. The lock still fastened from the outside. They hadn't checked on her yet. Nancy collapsed onto the worn mattress, pulling the thin blanket over her trembling body. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside, heard the slide of the viewing slot opening. She closed her eyes, steadied her breathing, pretending to sleep. The slot closed. The footsteps retreated. She was safe. For now. Night fell over Thornbury Mill like a suffocating blanket, and Nancy lay motionless on her mattress, staring at the ceiling where moonlight filtered through cracks in the rotted wood. Her body ached from the day's journey, but her mind refused rest. The image of her father's broken form at her gravestone played endlessly behind her closed eyelids. She'd never seen him cry before. Not once in her 12 years had she witnessed the powerful Duke of Ravencrest shed a single tear. Now he wept at an empty grave while she breathed in this forgotten tomb. Hours passed. The mill settled into its nightly symphony of creaks and groans. Nancy had just begun to drift toward an exhausted sleep when voices jolted her awake. Laughter, clear and distinct, coming from downstairs in what used to be the millkeeper's cottage. Her heart seized. In 6 months of imprisonment, she'd never heard voices. Only footsteps. Only the sound of her food tray sliding under the door. Whoever kept her here had remained faceless shadows, and that anonymity had been its own special terror. But now they were speaking, and they were close. Nancy slid from the mattress, her bare feet silent on the coal floorboards. She crept to the door and found it slightly ajar. Careless. They'd grown so confident in her broken state that they no longer bothered with caution. She pressed her eye to the narrow opening, peering down the hallway toward the stairs. Golden lamplight spilled from the sitting room below. Through the gap, she could see into the space, could see two figures seated before the fireplace, crystal glasses catching the firelight. And then one of them turned, and Nancy's entire world shattered. Duchess Paulina Thovin, her stepmother, the woman who had raised her since she was 6 years old, who had braided her hair and read her bedtime stories, who had kissed her forehead and called her "my dear girl." She sat in an elegant chair, dressed in deep purple silk, a glass of champagne raised in toast. Across from her sat a man Nancy knew equally well, Vincent Thovin, her father's cousin. Uncle Vincent, who had taught her to ride, who had brought her sweets from London, who had made her laugh with silly voices and elaborate stories. They were her captors. Nancy's legs nearly gave out. She clutched the doorframe, forcing herself to remain standing, to keep listening. 6 months already, Vincent, Paulina said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. 6 perfect months, and not a single soul has questioned it. They all believe the scarlet fever story. Even that simpleton physician we bribed barely blinked when we handed him 500 pounds. Vincent laughed, low and cruel. Dr. Carstairs played his part beautifully. The death certificate looked entirely legitimate. And my dear cousin, Lucian? He took a long sip of champagne. How does the great Duke suffer? Like a dog, Paulina spat, and Nancy watched in horror as the woman's face twisted with venomous pleasure. He weeps constantly, can barely function. It's pathetic, really. The mighty Duke of Ravencrest, brought to his knees by grief. She raised her glass higher. But his suffering serves our purpose perfectly. He's so consumed by mourning that he doesn't notice the gifts I bring him. The laudanum, Vincent said, grinning. The laudanum, Paulina confirmed, laced with just enough arsenic to kill him slowly. 3 months now, and his health deteriorates right on schedule. The physicians attribute it to grief, to a broken heart. How poetic. She laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Soon, very soon, we'll attend another funeral. And this time there will actually be a body in the coffin. Nancy's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the scream that threatened to tear from her throat. Poison. They were poisoning her father, killing him slowly while he mourned a daughter who wasn't even dead. To our victory, Vincent raised his glass. To the fortune we'll inherit. To the empire we'll build on the ashes of that fool's grief. And to the disposal of loose ends, Paulina added, her eyes glinting. Once Lucian is dead, we'll deal with the girl. A tragic accident in Scotland, perhaps. Then nothing stands in our way. They clinked glasses and sealed their toast with a kiss that made Nancy's stomach turn. She stumbled backward, hands still clamped over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The monsters who held her prisoner weren't strangers. They were family. People she'd trusted, people she'd loved, and they were going to kill her father. If you're gripping your seat right now wondering how Nancy will save her father, subscribe to this channel. Just like Nancy refused to let evil win, we refuse to let you miss what happens next. Nancy pressed herself against the wall of her prison room, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. The words she'd heard replayed in her mind like a death sentence. Arsenic, poison, 3 months. Her father was dying, had been dying while she rotted in this mill, and she'd known nothing. How much time did he have left? Days? Weeks? The urgency crashed over her like a tidal wave, drowning out every other thought. She couldn't wait, couldn't plan, couldn't hesitate for even a moment. She had to reach him tonight. Nancy moved to the window with trembling hands. Gripping the loose bars she'd worked free over weeks of patient effort. Below, she heard Paulina and Vincent's laughter continuing, their voices muffled but celebratory. They had no idea she'd heard everything. No idea their perfect plan was about to unravel. She squeezed through the narrow opening, the rusted metal scraping her arms and drawing blood. The pain barely registered. She dropped to the ground outside, landing hard on frozen earth that knocked the wind from her lungs. For a moment, she lay gasping, staring up at the stars that had witnessed her imprisonment. Then she ran. The Yorkshire moors stretched endlessly before her, a treacherous landscape of hidden bogs, jutting rocks, and ancient stone walls. In daylight, with proper shoes and guidance, the journey to Ravencrest Manor took an hour. At night, barefoot, weak from months of captivity, it might kill her. But staying would definitely kill her father. Nancy ran until her lungs burned, until every breath felt like swallowing knives. The frozen ground tore at her feet, leaving bloody footprints in her wake. Twice she stumbled into hidden ditches, the icy water soaking her tattered dress. Once she fell face first into a patch of thorny gorse, the needles embedding in her palms and cheeks. Each time she got up, each time she kept running, her mind filled with visions that drove her forward like a whip. Her father, trusting Paulina, drinking the poisoned laudanum she prepared with loving hands. Her father growing weaker each day, attributing it to grief when it was murder. Her father dying alone, believing his daughter was already gone, never knowing she'd fought to reach him. "I'm coming, Father," she whispered through cracked lips. "Hold on. Please, just hold on." The darkness seemed infinite, pressing in from all sides. Several times Nancy lost her bearings, spinning in circles until she spotted a familiar landmark, the old shepherd's cottage, the crooked oak struck by lightning, the stone bridge over the creek. Each one brought her closer to home, closer to salvation. Dawn began to break as she finally spotted the outline of Ravencrest Manor in the distance. The sight of it, her home, her sanctuary, nearly broke her. Fresh tears streamed down her face, mixing with blood and dirt and sweat. Her legs, which had carried her through the impossible night, suddenly felt like they might give out entirely. She pushed herself harder, stumbling more than running now. The manor servant's entrance loomed before her, the door that had once been as familiar as breathing. Nancy collapsed against it, her fists pounding weakly on the heavy wood. "Please," she croaked, her voice barely audible. "Please, someone. Help." Her vision swam, the world tilted dangerously. She clutched the silver locket around her neck, the one her father had given her, the one she'd hidden from her captors for 6 months. It had sustained her through the darkest nights, a reminder that love was real, that home existed beyond her prison walls. The door opened suddenly and Nancy fell forward into warmth and light. She heard a woman scream, recognized the voice of Mrs. Dorothy Henshaw, the housekeeper who'd known her since birth. "Dear God in heaven, it's Lady Nancy. She's alive. Someone fetch the Duke. Fetch him now." Footsteps thundered above. Voices shouted in confusion and disbelief. Nancy lay on the floor, too exhausted to move, barely conscious. But through her fading vision, she saw him. Her father appeared at the top of the stairs in his nightshirt, his face a portrait of confusion. Then his eyes found her, and he froze. "Nancy." The word came out like a prayer, like a question directed at God himself. She tried to smile, tried to speak, but darkness was pulling her under. Her last conscious thought was that she'd made it. Against all odds, she'd reached him in time. Duke Lucian Thalvin stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. His daughter, his Nancy, lying on the entrance floor, covered in blood and dirt, her dress torn to ribbons, her bare feet bleeding. Dead. She was dead. He'd buried her 6 months ago. This had to be the laudanum, had to be grief finally breaking his sanity. But then she moved. Her chest rose and fell. Her lips formed his name. "Father." The words shattered his paralysis. Lucian flew down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, and dropped to his knees beside her. His hands shook as he reached out, terrified that touching her would make her disappear like smoke. But she was solid, real, warm. "Nancy," he breathed, gathering her into his arms. "My God, Nancy." She wrapped her thin arms around his neck and began to sob. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a lady, but the desperate, gulping cries of a child who'd been holding everything inside for far too long. Lucian held her tighter, his own tears flowing freely as he buried his face in her matted hair. "It's you," he kept repeating. "It's really you. You're alive. My daughter, you're alive." Mrs. Henshaw stood nearby, weeping into her apron. Other servants gathered, staring in shock at the girl they'd mourned. But Lucian saw none of them. His entire world had collapsed into this moment, this miracle of his daughter breathing against his chest. Finally, Nancy pulled back slightly, her small hands gripping his nightshirt. "Father, listen to me. We don't have time. You're in danger. Terrible danger." "Hush now," he murmured, trying to soothe her. "You're safe. You're home. Nothing else matters." "No," her voice came out sharp, urgent. "Father, you have to listen. I didn't die in London. I was never sick with scarlet fever. It was all lies. All planned." Her words tumbled out faster, desperate. "Duchess Paulina and Uncle Vincent, they orchestrated everything. They faked my death, bribed Dr. Carstairs to write a false certificate. They've been holding me prisoner at Thornbury Mill for 6 months." Lucian's arms tightened around her, his face draining of color. "What? Nancy, that's impossible. Paulina? Vincent? They've helped me through. They've been poisoning you." Nancy grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "The laudanum, Father, the medicine Paulina gives you every night for sleep, it's laced with arsenic. For 3 months, they've been killing you slowly. I heard them last night, celebrating, planning your funeral." The words hit Lucian like physical blows. He stood abruptly, still holding Nancy, and carried her to his private study. He kicked the door shut behind them and settled her into his leather chair, wrapping his greatcoat around her trembling shoulders. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Every single detail." Nancy recounted it all, the tea that made her sleep unnaturally, waking in the mill, 6 months of imprisonment, her escape to the cemetery, what she'd overheard about the poison, the inheritance, their plans to dispose of her once he was dead. As she spoke, Lucian's face transformed. The grief-stricken, broken man vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. When she finished, he paced the study like a caged lion, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "My own cousin," he growled, "the woman I trusted with my home, with my daughter. They held you captive while I wept at your grave, while they comforted me, while I drank their poison." He slammed his fist against the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Nancy flinched, and immediately he was beside her again, kneeling, taking her hands. "I'm sorry, darling. I'm not angry at you, never at you." He took a shaking breath. "But I need to confront them. Now, tonight. I'll have them arrested, see them hang for what they've done." "No, Victor." Nancy's voice was steady despite her fear. "If they know I've escaped, if they suspect you know the truth, they'll disappear. Or worse, they'll kill us both. They're desperate and dangerous." Lucian studied his daughter's face, seeing a strength there he'd never noticed before. "Then what do you suggest?" A look passed between them, understanding blooming without words. Nancy squeezed his hands. "We have to be smarter than them, more cunning. We have to make them believe they're winning right until the moment we destroy them." Lucian's lips curved into a grim smile. "What are you thinking?" "You're already dying in their eyes," Nancy said slowly. "So let's give them what they want. Let them think the poison is working. Let them plan your funeral." Her voice hardened. "And then, when they're celebrating their victory, when they think they've won everything, we'll show them what it means to betray the House of Thauvin." Dawn broke over Ravencrest Manor, but Duke Lucian Thauvin didn't sleep. He sat with Nancy in his study, mapping out their strategy with the precision of a military campaign. Every detail had to be perfect. One mistake, one moment of suspicion, and Paulina and Vincent would vanish like smoke, taking their crimes with them. "You'll have to return to the mill," Lucian said, the words clearly causing him physical pain, "before they discover you're gone." Nancy nodded, though her hands trembled at the thought. "I know, Father. If they find my room empty, they'll suspect everything." 2 weeks, he promised, gripping her shoulders. Give me 2 weeks to arrange everything, and then you'll never go back to that place again. Can you be strong for 2 more weeks? For you? Nancy managed a small smile. I can be strong for a lifetime. Before dawn fully broke, Nancy slipped back across the moors, retracing her bloody path to Thornbury Mill. She climbed through her window just as the first light touched the horizon, collapsing onto her mattress moments before she heard footsteps outside her door. The viewing slot opened, closed. They never suspected a thing. Meanwhile, at Ravencrest Manor, Lucian began his performance. He dismissed the servants who'd witnessed Nancy's appearance, swearing them to absolute secrecy on pain of dismissal. Mrs. Henshaw, loyal to the core, gathered those present and made the threat clear. Speak one word of what you saw, and you'll answer to me before you answer to His Grace. The young lady's life depends on your silence. Then Lucian transformed himself into a dying man. He stopped taking the laudanum Paulina had been preparing, pouring it instead into a hidden container that would later serve as evidence. He replaced it with a harmless tincture that allowed him to sleep. But each morning he emerged from his chambers looking worse than the day before. He canceled appointments, stopped attending parliamentary sessions, refused visitors. When he did appear, he moved slowly, leaning heavily on furniture, his face pale and drawn. He employed every trick of theater: shallow breathing, trembling hands, a distant gaze that suggested a man barely clinging to life. Paulina noticed immediately. "Darling," she cooed one morning, bringing him tea in the drawing room, "you look dreadful. Perhaps you should see Dr. Carstairs again." "No doctors," Lucian mumbled, playing his part perfectly. "They can't cure a broken heart. Let me be, Paulina." She exchanged a glance with Vincent, who'd conveniently arrived for an extended stay at the manor. The look between them said everything. It's working. He's dying faster than we planned. In private, they celebrated. Lucian, using secret passages he'd explored as a boy, watched them through hidden panels. He saw them toast with champagne in Paulina's private rooms, heard them laugh about his rapid decline. "The fool can barely stand," Vincent chuckled. "Another month at most, and we'll be planning his funeral." "Less than that, I think," Paulina replied, swirling her wine. "I've increased the dosage. Why wait when victory is so close?" But she'd been increasing the dosage of nothing. The laudanum Lucian pretended to drink went straight into evidence jars that Dr. Harold Bancroft, Lucian's trusted physician and friend since university, was analyzing. The arsenic content was enough to kill a horse. Dr. Bancroft also proved invaluable in another way. As the only physician Lucian truly trusted, he helped stage the medical decline that would make the eventual death believable. "Your heart is weakening," Dr. Bancroft announced loudly during a house call, knowing Paulina listened outside the door. "The grief has taken a severe toll, Your Grace. I fear we must prepare for the worst." Lucian made sure to groan appropriately, to ask in a weak voice how much time he had left. "Weeks, perhaps," Dr. Bancroft said gravely. "A month at most." Outside the door, Paulina's smile could practically be heard. Meanwhile, Lucian wasn't idle. He contacted Scotland Yard through trusted intermediaries. Inspector Thomas Grayson, a man Lucian had helped years ago, took personal charge of the investigation. They gathered evidence methodically: records of Dr. Carstairs' sudden wealth, property records showing Vincent's ownership of Thornbury Mill, witnesses who'd seen Paulina purchasing unusual quantities of patent medicines. Most damning of all, they discovered Dr. Edmund Carstairs himself. Under pressure and promised immunity for testimony, the physician crumbled like wet paper. He confessed everything: the 500 pounds, the forged death certificate, the lies he told. His confession was recorded, witnessed, and sealed. In her cell at Thornbury Mill, Nancy marked the days on the wall with a sliver of stone. 14 scratches until freedom, until justice. Each night she whispered prayers for her father's safety, trusting that his performance was convincing enough to keep him alive. And in London's most prestigious townhouse on Grosvenor Square, Duke Lucian Thaven prepared for the greatest performance of his life, his own death. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the final curtain was about to rise on a drama that would shake Victorian England to its core. If Nancy's courage and Lucian's cunning have you on the edge of your seat, subscribe now. Just like they refused to let betrayal win, we won't let you miss the explosive finale. The 14th day arrived with gray skies over London, as if the heavens themselves mourned the Duke of Ravencrest. In truth, it was the perfect weather for what was about to unfold. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Harold Bancroft emerged from the Grosvenor Square townhouse, his face ashen, his steps heavy. The small crowd that had gathered outside, journalists, curious neighbors, business associates, pressed forward immediately. "The Duke?" someone called out. Dr. Bancroft removed his spectacles, wiping them slowly, a man buying time before delivering devastating news. "His Grace, Duke Lucian Thalvin passed peacefully in his sleep at 7:30 this morning." His voice cracked with what seemed like genuine emotion. Heart failure brought on by profound and prolonged grief. He never recovered from the loss of his daughter. The murmur that rippled through the crowd quickly became a roar. Within an hour, every newspaper in London carried the headline, "Duke of Ravencrest dead. Grief claims second victim." By noon, all of England knew. Inside the townhouse, the lying in state began. Lucian lay in an open casket in the grand parlor, his face pale with powder, his body still with the help of breathing techniques he'd practiced for days. Hundreds came to pay respects. Fellow peers, members of parliament, American railroad magnates who'd crossed the Atlantic for the funeral. Each filed past, shaking their heads at the tragedy of a man who died of a broken heart. Paulina played her part magnificently. Dressed in deepest black, her face hidden behind a heavy veil, she stood beside the casket, receiving mourners. Her performance was worthy of the Royal Opera House. She swayed on her feet, requiring Vincent's steadying hand. She wept delicately into lace handkerchiefs. She murmured broken phrases about my beloved husband, and taken too soon that drew sympathetic tears from hardened businessmen. Vincent, too, excelled in his role. His eulogy, delivered to the packed parlor, moved several attendees to open sobbing. "My cousin was more than blood to me," he said, his voice trembling. "He was my dearest friend, my partner, my brother in all but name. The loss of Lady Nancy destroyed him, and now both are gone. The Thalvin line, so noble and ancient, reduced to memory." He paused, pressing a handkerchief to his eyes. "But I swear before God and these witnesses, I shall honor his legacy with every breath I take." The applause was respectful but heartfelt. No one suspected that Vincent was already mentally cataloging which properties he'd sell first. The funeral at Westminster Abbey 3 days later was even more elaborate. The cathedral overflowed with mourners. Minor royalty attended. The Archbishop himself presided over the service. Hymns echoed off ancient stone walls. The casket, draped in the Thalvin family crest, sat before the altar like an altar of its own. Throughout it all, hidden in a private gallery reserved for family, two figures watched in silence. Lucian, very much alive, sat beside Nancy, who'd escaped from the mill the previous night, for the final time. His arm wrapped around her shoulders as they observed the spectacle below. "There," Nancy whispered, pointing. "Do you see them?" During the final hymn, Paulina and Vincent's eyes met across the aisle. The look they exchanged lasted only a moment, but it spoke volumes. A slight smile touched Paulina's lips. Vincent gave the barest nod. Victory. They believed they'd won. After the service, the mourners filed out, but Lucian and Nancy remained, watching from their concealed position as Paulina and Vincent waited until they were alone in a side chapel. "Finally," Paulina breathed, pulling off her veil. Her face, so grief-stricken moments ago, now glowed with triumph. "God, what a tedious performance. My face aches from all that crying." Vincent laughed, pulling her close. "But effective. Did you see Lord Pemberton weeping?" And the American delegation looked positively devastated. "To the Duke and Duchess of Ravencrest," Paulina said, producing a silver flask. "The titles have such a lovely ring, don't they?" "To the fortune we've earned," Vincent added, taking a swig. 10,000 acres. Railway shares worth millions. Properties spanning 2 continents. All ours. And no loose ends," Paulina said, her voice turning cold. "Once we've secured everything, we'll deal with that wretched girl in the mill. A fall from the cliffs in Scotland should do nicely. then absolutely nothing stands between us and everything we deserve. They sealed their toast with a passionate kiss. Above them, Nancy trembled with rage. Lucian's jaw clenched so tightly she could hear his teeth grinding, but he remained still, watching, waiting. Their moment would come. That evening, back in their secret location, Lucian met with Inspector Grayson and Mr. Blackwood, his solicitor. "Everything is arranged?" Lucian asked. "The will reading is scheduled for 2 weeks from today," Mr. Blackwood confirmed. "Every necessary party has been notified. The court has been reserved." Inspector Grayson nodded. "My men will be in position. Dr. Carstairs is prepared to testify. We have enough evidence to hang them both 3 times over." Lucian looked at Nancy, who sat in the corner, finally safe, finally free from the mill. 2 more weeks, and this nightmare ends. The chambers of Blackwood and Sons solicitors on Fleet Street had never seen such an assembly. Every polished chair in the oak-paneled room was occupied by someone of importance. Peers of the realm, high court judges, members of parliament, American business magnates who'd sailed across the Atlantic specifically for this occasion. The reading of Duke Lucian Thauvin's will was more than a legal formality. It was the transfer of one of England's greatest fortunes. Duchess Paulina Thauvin arrived in a gown of elegant lavender silk, the appropriate mourning color for 6 months of widowhood. She'd abandoned the heavy black veils for something that suggested grief tempered by dignified resilience. Her entrance drew approving nods. "Such strength," people murmured. "Such grace under unbearable loss." Vincent Thauvin followed, dressed impeccably in charcoal gray, his bearing already that of a duke. He shook hands with fellow peers, accepted condolences with humble nods, and took his seat at the front with the air of a man shouldering great responsibility without complaint. Mr. Reginald Blackwood, senior partner of the firm and the Thauvin family's solicitor for 40 years, sat at the head of the long table. His aged hands held the sealed will, and his expression gave nothing away. He'd perfected that neutral mask over decades of handling England's most sensitive legal matters. "We are gathered," Mr. Blackwood began, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony, "to execute the last will and testament of His Grace, Lucian Edward Thauvin, Duke of Ravencrest, who departed this life on the 14th of November in the year of our Lord, 1873. Paulina dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Vincent folded his hands, picture of solemn respect. Mr. Blackwood broke the seal and unfolded the document. "To my beloved wife, Paulina Margaret Thauvin, I bequeath—" The chamber doors exploded inward. The crash was so violent that a bust of King George toppled from its pedestal, shattering on the marble floor. Every head whipped toward the entrance. Gasps rippled through the room like a wave. Several people stood so abruptly their chairs fell backward. Duke Lucian Thauvin strode through the doorway, very much alive, his face carved from granite and fury. Beside him, hand clasped tightly in his, walked Lady Nancy Thauvin, the girl all of England had mourned 6 months prior. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes. Then pandemonium erupted, shouts of disbelief. A woman fainted. Chairs scraped. Someone dropped their walking stick with a clatter that echoed like a gunshot. But the most dramatic reaction came from the front of the room. Paulina's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened in a soundless scream. The handkerchief fell from her nerveless fingers. "No," she whispered. "No, this is impossible. You're dead. I watched them bury you. This is some trick. Some horrible—" Vincent lunged from his chair toward the side door, but found his path blocked 2 large men in the uniforms of Scotland Yard. Inspector Thomas Grayson stepped forward, his expression grim. "I wouldn't, Mr. Thauvin," the inspector said quietly. "There's nowhere to run." Lucian's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Silence." The room obeyed instantly, every eye fixed on the Duke who'd returned from the dead. "For 6 months," Lucian began, his voice shaking with controlled rage, "this nation mourned my daughter, mourned her death from scarlet fever, a tragic loss that devastated a father's heart." He pulled Nancy closer to his side. "But my daughter never died. She was kidnapped, imprisoned in an abandoned mill, held captive by the very people who should have protected her." He pointed directly at Paulina and Vincent. "By my wife, and by my cousin. The gasps that followed were like a collective punch to the gut of everyone present. Paulina found her voice shrill and desperate. Lies! He's mad with grief, can't you see? The girl is an imposter. Some street urchin he's paid to. I heard everything, Nancy's clear young voice rang out, stopping Paulina cold. I heard you celebrate my kidnapping. I heard you laugh about the 500 pounds you paid Dr. Carstairs to forge my death certificate. I heard you toast to father's murder while he drank the arsenic you put in his laudanum every night. Vincent tried to bluster. The child is confused, traumatized. This is absurd. Is it? Lucian's voice was ice. Inspector Grayson, if you please. The inspector stepped forward holding a leather portfolio. We have Dr. Edmund Carstairs in custody. He's confessed to falsifying Lady Nancy's death certificate in exchange for payment from Duchess Paulina. We have chemical analysis of the laudanum showing lethal levels of arsenic. We have property records proving Mr. Vincent Thalvin's ownership of Thornbury Mill, where Lady Nancy was held prisoner. He looked at the assembled witnesses. We have enough evidence to see them both hanged. Paulina screamed, standing so quickly her chair toppled. You were supposed to die. The poison should have killed you weeks ago. This isn't fair. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Vincent's face crumbled. Paulina, shut your mouth, you fool. Don't you dare, she shrieked at him. This was your plan. You said it would work. You said we'd be untouchable. As they turned on each other like rabid dogs, constables moved forward with iron shackles. The courtroom erupted into chaos as constables dragged Paulina and Vincent away in irons. Their screams echoed down the marble corridors of the solicitor's chambers. Accusations hurled at each other. Desperate pleas for mercy that fell on deaf ears. The assembled witnesses sat stunned, trying to process what they'd witnessed. Some wept openly. Others simply stared, mouths agape, at the magnitude of the betrayal. But Lucian and Nancy heard none of it. They'd already slipped away, escaping through a side entrance while the spectacle consumed everyone's attention. They had one final task to complete, one last ghost to lay to rest. The ride back to Ravencrest Manor was silent. Nancy sat pressed against her father's side in the carriage, her hand never leaving his. They'd spoken so many words over the past 2 weeks, plans, strategies, testimonies rehearsed until perfect. Now, approaching the end of their ordeal, words seemed inadequate. The gentle rocking of the carriage and the sound of hooves on the road were comfort enough. The Yorkshire countryside rolled past the windows, autumn gold and beautiful. Nancy watched it with new eyes. Everything looked different now. The same hills and stone walls and distant sheep, but transformed by freedom. She would never take the simple act of looking out a window for granted again. When they arrived at Ravencrest Manor, servants lined up to greet them, many weeping with joy at seeing Lady Nancy alive. Mrs. Henshaw embraced her so tightly Nancy could barely breathe, murmuring prayers of thanksgiving. But Lucian gently extracted his daughter from the celebration. We'll have time for all this later, he said softly. Right now, there's somewhere we need to go. Hand in hand, they walked to the family cemetery. The November afternoon was clear and cold, the sky that particular shade of blue that only comes in late autumn. Their footsteps crunched on frost-covered grass as they approached the white marble tomb that had haunted them both for 6 months, Nancy's tomb, her false grave, the monument to a lie. They stood before it in silence. The inscription mocked them with its false piety. Nancy Elizabeth Thalvin, beloved daughter, taken by fever, may she rest in God's grace. Lucian's jaw clenched as he read the words again, remembering every tear he'd shed here, every prayer he'd screamed at an empty sky. Without a word, he approached the tomb and placed his hands on the cold marble. Nancy watched as her father, the powerful Duke of Ravencrest, pushed against the stone with all his remaining strength. The muscles in his arms strained, his face reddened with effort. A vein throbbed in his temple. The monument shifted. Then, with a grinding crack that echoed across the cemetery, it toppled. The marble hit the ground and split in two, the pieces falling away to reveal the empty vault beneath. Inside was nothing but the porcelain doll Nancy had loved as a child, the one they'd buried as a symbol of her supposed death. Nancy stepped forward and knelt, reaching into the vault to retrieve the doll. She held it close, remembering the girl she'd been 6 months ago. Innocent, trusting, believing the world was safe. That girl was gone, transformed by betrayal and survival into someone stronger. Someone who understood that evil could wear familiar faces. "I wasn't born to be buried, Father," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I was born to live, to grow, to carry our family's name with honor, not to rot in the ground while monsters stole everything you built." Lucian knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms. "And I'll live to see you do it," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll be there for every step, every dream, every victory. Nothing, not death, not betrayal, not all the poison in England, will ever separate us again." They stayed embraced as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery. Around them, the other graves stood silent witness to this moment of resurrection. Where death had once claimed victory, life now triumphed. Where lies had flourished, truth had torn them down. Finally, Lucian stood and helped Nancy to her feet. Together they looked at the broken monument, the shattered lie scattered across the ground. "Leave it," Lucian said when cemetery workers approached to clean the debris. "Leave it exactly as it is. Let it stand as a reminder that some things, once broken, should never be repaired. Let it remind anyone who passes that truth, no matter how long buried, will always claw its way back to the light." They walked away from the cemetery together, leaving the broken gravestone behind. The setting sun painted Ravencrest Manor's ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Smoke curled from the chimneys, promising warmth and safety inside. It looked exactly as a home should look, a place of shelter and love, purged now of the poison that had infected it. Nancy paused at the cemetery gate and looked back one final time at the tomb that had held her name. Then she turned to face forward, toward the manor, toward the future, toward life. "I'm ready, Father," she said simply. Lucian squeezed her hand. "So am I, darling. So am I." Together they walked toward home, their shadows stretching long behind them in the fading light. Two figures united and unbroken, carrying scars that would never fully heal, but refusing to let those scars define them. They'd descended into darkness and clawed their way back to the light. They'd faced betrayal and answered it with courage. They'd been broken and had chosen to rebuild. Some stories don't end with death. They begin again when you choose to live, when you refuse to let evil have the final word, when love proves stronger than any poison. The Thauvin legacy would continue, not through the monsters who tried to steal it, but through a father and daughter who understood that true nobility wasn't found in titles or fortunes, but in the courage to fight for truth, no matter the cost. If this story of courage, betrayal, and triumph moved you, don't let this be where our connection ends. Subscribe now because, just like Nancy and Lucian refused to let their story end in darkness, we're creating more tales that prove light always defeats the shadows. Your next incredible journey starts with one click.
If you enjoyed this story, we appreciate you a whole lot and look forward to connecting with you as we build a community on this channel. Every day, we will put out more stories, so we need your support. Help us by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. You won't miss any new exciting videos. Check out the next video. You'll love it!